Let's explain the point of proofs. Now, there is a handout that is on, if you go, let's see, let's go back here, yes, the page. If you go to the regular page and you click on handouts, and then somewhat unnecessarily you might think you click on handouts for the course, what other handouts would be relevant, it takes you to this page. And the one that I'm going to talk about today says it's new. It's not really new, but I haven't changed this page for a while. It's called Doing Proofs, and it looks like this. And I'm going to talk about that today. Okay, so we've learned how to do we've learned how to use truth tables to test for validity. We've learned the long method and the shortcut method test for validity. So now, for any argument, any symbolized argument, we have a method for telling whether or not the argument is valid. Right? That was part of your homework, your last homework. So what's the point of a proof? What does a proof do? A proof seems to be, on the one hand, might seem a little bit redundant. Because what a proof does is it demonstrates that an argument is valid. So, if I can give a proof of an argument, that shows that the argument is valid. Well, but I can show that an argument is valid by doing the shortcut test. Why do we need this proof? Well, because a proof does a little bit more than the shortcut method does. The shortcut method is like a validity tester. You know, imagine if you had a box and you pointed an argument, and if it's valid, a little light goes on and say, yes, it's valid. But it doesn't tell you why it's valid. It just says yes, no. It gives you a yes, no answer to the question, is it valid? Now, proofs actually only work on valid arguments. You can only give a proof of a valid argument. If you try to give a proof of an invalid argument, you will never be able to finish it. And if you think you finished it, you made a mistake. So in that sense, they're kind of more restricted than the truth table method, because the truth table method will tell you if it will work on an invalid argument. However, there is a value to being able to show that, not just that an argument is valid, but to demonstrate why it's valid. And to illustrate, let me give you an example of an actual argument that comes up in philosophy. This is a famous, not quite, but no, but it's similar kind of subject matter. This is an example of an argument that comes up in philosophy of religion. And I've hidden the conclusion for a good reason, as you'll see. When do you give arguments? If you asked me what time it was, and I answered you, would I have to give an argument? Okay, so when do you need to give arguments? When the conclusion is a matter of dispute. That's right. So of course, the easy examples to give are in a court case, when of course the prosecution and the defense are opposed. You don't have to write this down because you can print it out off the webpage. Because of course the prosecution and the defense are at odds. They believe different conclusions. One believes that the defendant should be found guilty, and the other believes that the defendant should be found not guilty. So of course, in cases like that, that's when you really do have to give arguments, because there's disagreement over the conclusion. Now, if I'm going to give an argument, there's a reason for it. It means that we disagree over the conclusion. What should my premises be like? Should my premises be equally controversial? No, there wouldn't be any point to that, would there? Because what I'm trying to do with the conclusion is I'm trying to convince you I started without you. Maybe you can see if it's pointed the right way. There wouldn't be a point to be giving controversial premises, because I'm trying to convince you. I'm trying to show you that the controversial conclusion that I'm advocating follows logically from things that you believe. So the premises should be uncontroversial. They should be things that we agree on. And then, if I can demonstrate that the thing I'm claiming follows validly from premises that you agree, then you've got good reason to change your view, because logic is compelling you. Logic is demonstrating that actually you really do believe the thing that I'm saying, because you believe things that imply it logically. Okay? So that's the value. Now, when do you need to give a proof? Well, you need to give a proof when it's not really clear why the controversial conclusion follows from the less controversial premises. So this is an example. Now, I'm not saying this, well, you'll see. This is, like I said, this is a famous argument that has been discussed for nearly, probably over 2,000 years. In fact, yes, I think the most famous early instance of this argument dates back to the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus. And it's a version of what's called the problem of evil. Okay, but first of all, I want to check whether or not you agree that these premises are uncontroversial. Premise one. Premise one is just a definition. It's a definition of the word omnipotent. Who's familiar with the word omnipotent? Right, it means all-powerful. All right, so it says, a being that is omnipotent can do anything. Anyone disagree with that? Okay, so pretty uncontroversial so far. We've got universal agreement, yeah? All right, premise two. This is a little oddly worded, but you'll see what I'm saying. A being that loves another being would always prevent that other being from ever feeling unnecessary suffering unless the first being was unable to prevent the suffering. So in other words, if you love someone, you want to prevent them suffering. Do you agree? Who agrees? Okay, so no disagreement so far, right? All right. Premise three. If God exists, God is omnipotent. Now, even if you're a raving atheist, you could agree with that, because that's what the definition of God, right? God is supposed to be omnipotent. So if God exists, God would be omnipotent. Because if something exists that wasn't omnipotent, it wouldn't be God. That's what always bugged me about that song, that 90s song, What If God Was One of Us? Anyone remember that? Just a stranger on the bus, with the line about nobody calling on the phone except the Pope sometimes in Rome. It's like, that's got to be the worst couplet in all popular music, unless it was meant as a joke. You know, because if it's just a stranger on the bus, it's not God, right? It's because God is omnipotent. And that's, you know, that's a pretty strange bus. All right, so you can agree. Even if you're an atheist, you can agree with that, right? Yeah? So no disagreement so far. All right, if God exists, God loves all humans. Now, if you believe in the if you believe in the gods of ancient Greece, you would reject both of these. Because the gods of ancient Greece, they're not omnipotent, they're always fighting amongst themselves, and they don't love all humans. They mess with humans, right? They use us for their sport. But certainly the Abrahamic faiths, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, they endorse both these views, right? So anyone disagree with either of these? Have we got any ancient Greek god believers? Yeah, you worship the ancient gods? Okay, good for you. Or the Norse gods, maybe, influenced by Thor movies. Yeah, they're kind of the same way. They just fight amongst themselves and use us for their sport. But the rest of you guys, you would agree with that, right? Okay. Many, if not all humans, have felt unnecessary suffering. You may be feeling that merely reading this is unnecessary suffering. Anyone disagree with that? If you disagree that you felt unnecessary suffering, allow me to come and stamp on your foot. Okay? All right, so everybody agrees with those premises, right? With the exception of Jet. But everybody else agrees with those premises, right? Let's see if you agree with the conclusion, which I'm going to say follows through deductive validity from those premises. Anyone disagree with that? Be honest. Yes, I would imagine quite a few people disagree with that. So, And you didn't see that coming. You didn't think, oh, in agreeing to these, I'm also agreeing that God does not exist, right? So if I'm going to say that is actually a valid argument, and what does it mean to say that an argument is valid again? Reminds me. The premises guarantee the conclusion, which means if these premises are all true, this has to be true. Because in some sense it's contained within the premises. Okay, you didn't think in agreeing to these, you were agreeing to that. So if I'm going to say this is a valid argument, I better damn well prove it. Hey, proofs. That's what they're about. So, now this is going to be an informal proof. In other words, it's not going to look just like the proofs you're going to be doing. But it's a similar idea in that what you're going to do is you're going to produce something like this. What do you think that is an abbreviation for? Not much of an abbreviation. Subconclusion. When did we come across that word before? What's that?
Diagramming arguments.
Diagramming arguments, that's right. Remember these? Which one is the conclusion? 3. Which one is the subconclusion? So what's distinctive about subconclusions? They're not the overall conclusion, but they're different from, say, 1, which is not a subconclusion. How?
They act as a conclusion for some premises, but they are a premise to the final conclusion.
Right. Relative to other premises, they are a conclusion. In other words, they follow logically from other premises, but they're not the overall conclusion. That's exactly what we're going to do here. So each of these follows logically from the initial premises we've got. So this bunch are like 1. In other words, they are unsupported by anything else. They're just given, because you all agreed with them. I don't have to argue for these, because you all said, yeah, that seems right. So I don't have to give an argument for those. But each of these subconclusions. Now, how do we reach these subconclusions? This is where the rules come in, of which you have learned 9. Because what they are little obviously valid arguments. So stop cracking your knuckles. So you're throwing me off. You're throwing me off completely. You use obviously valid little arguments, and you apply them to the premises that you've got, and you get sort of little intermediary steps. So each of these steps should be self-evidently valid that it follows from these. And if by a series of these little baby steps, each of which you can't deny because they're obviously valid, we then reach the conclusion, then you are forced to accept the conclusion, because we've reached it by baby steps, each one of which made perfect sense. Whereas here, it's like a huge leap. And you think, whoa, 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 I'm not accepting that. I just accepted these. That doesn't mean I have to accept this. But if I drag you there step by step, then you pretty much have to accept it. And that's what a proof is supposed to do. Now, by the way, in case you're worried that, at the end of this exam, at the end of this class, I put on the exam, does God exist, yes or no? No. That is not the point of this exercise. As I said, this is an argument that is over 2,000 years old, and strangely belief in God has persisted. So clearly there are responses to this argument, many famous responses. So I'm not saying that this is a sound argument. A sound argument is a valid argument whose premises are all true. But if this is valid, and you reject the conclusion, what that means is you have to reject one of the premises. Because in a valid argument, you can have a valid argument with a false conclusion, but what you can't have is a valid argument with all true premises and a false conclusion. So if you think that the conclusion of a valid argument is false, you must show that at least one of the premises is false as well. And that's the usual response. And in case you're interested, the usual one that people attack is this one. All right, unless they're Satanists, in which they reject number 4. Well, maybe Satan loves all humans, but just for lunch. Okay, so, subconclusion 1. A being that is omnipotent could prevent any unnecessary suffering. Now what I'm saying is this follows logically from premise 1. Why does it follow logically from premise 1? Yeah?
Preventing unnecessary suffering is a member of the set of anything you can ever do.
Right. So, premise 1 says God can do anything, and this is a thing, right? So clearly if God can do anything, God can do this. It's a particular instance of a thing. Now, That's rather inelegantly phrased, and probably somebody could pick that apart. And in fact, there is some discussion in philosophy of religion about whether or not omnipotence is actually best characterized as ability to do tasks or just to have a certain power, where power is not spelled out in terms of ability. But that's kind of dry. That's what philosophers of religion get into. All right, but it seems like that follows logically from premise 1, right? That makes sense? If you're able to do anything, you're able to prevent unnecessary suffering. And notice it says unnecessary suffering, not necessary suffering. Necessary suffering is sitting through this class. Okay, a being that loved humans would prevent unnecessary suffering from humans, unless it was unable to. So basically all I've done here is replace another being with the word humans. So again, it's an instance of getting more specific than the original general claim. Does that make sense? All right. If God exists, God is able to prevent unnecessary suffering. Well, that follows from if God exists, God is omnipotent, and added to the state to this, that a being that is omnipotent is able to prevent unnecessary suffering. So, if God exists, God is able to prevent unnecessary suffering. From a combination of premise 3, if God exists, God is omnipotent, and subconclusion 1. Does that make sense? So you see what I'm doing. What I'm doing at each step, I'm showing what further things are true if these original things are true. These further things follow logically by simply obviously valid little arguments. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's what's going on in each of these steps. If God exists, God is able to prevent unnecessary suffering to humans. If God exists, God would prevent unnecessary suffering to humans unless he was unable to. Because premise 4 says if God exists, God loves all humans. And if you love humans, you'll prevent unnecessary suffering to them. That's subconclusion 2. So if God exists, God would prevent unnecessary suffering. Now, this is probably the key step. If God exists, there would be no unnecessary human suffering. Why? Well, from subconclusions 3 and 4. If God exists, God's able to prevent it, and if God exists, God would prevent it. So if you're able to prevent something, and you would prevent it, put it together, it should be prevented. Right? So if God exists, there would be no unnecessary human suffering. Therefore, God doesn't exist. Now this one follows by one of the rules. Modus tollens. Modus tollens from subconclusion 5, which is if God exists there would be no unnecessary suffering, and premise 5, there is suffering. So basically it looks like this. E for it, God exists. If God exists, then no suffering. Suffering. What's the conclusion? Not E, which in this case would be God does not exist. And that's modus tollens, denying the consequent. So, what this shows is that you can reach that conclusion by a series of steps, each of which is self-evidently valid. That's what a proof does. Okay? And this is, and I wanted to show why there might be some point to that exercise. Because when you're actually doing it about real things that people argue about, you need to make it clear why the conclusion follows from the premises. And in fact, a lot of philosophy argumentation does this. It gives you a little proof. Okay? Now, your proofs will not look like this because this is all informal. Your proofs will look more like the piece that I'm missing. Here we go. This. So let's talk about, this is two different proofs of the same argument, just to illustrate that it's possible. But actually you haven't learned some of the rules yet. Some of these are inference rules, not inference forms, equivalence rules. So let's look, in fact, at page 379 in your textbook. All proofs look the same. They look like a series of numbered lines. So, suppose we are presented with this argument. Yeah, you have to remember that the text uses different symbols from the ones I've been teaching you. So the horseshoe means is equivalent to the arrow. Okay, suppose we are presented with this argument. If A then B, premise 1, if A then B, premise 2, if not A then C, premise 3, not B, conclusion C. Okay, now if you had to test that for validity, you know how to do it. You would make a little table with 4 columns, 3 for the premises, 1 for the conclusion, and you would try and make the conclusion, and you would try and make all the premises true, and you would fail because this is a valid argument. Okay? But what we want to do is prove it. So what does a proof look like? Well, what you do is the first 3 lines are going to be the premises that you've been given. If A then B, not A then C, and not B. Every line in a proof looks the same. Can you actually turn out the light? Right. You have something on the line that you are claiming is true. And then you have to write next to it how you know it's true. Well, in this case, you know it's true because it's just given to you. It's a premise. So you can abbreviate that as premise. Now, what do you think is on the last line of every proof? The conclusion, exactly. Because that's the point of the proof. The point is to show that you can start with the premises and arrive at the conclusion. So, consequently, you can't include the conclusion in the material you're given, because that's what you're trying to get. If you already had it, you wouldn't need to get it. But you do need to remind yourself that that's your goal. You're trying to get the conclusion. So what you need to do is write the conclusion somewhere to remind yourself this is what I'm trying to get. And for some reason, this has become the way of doing this. On the last premise line, you draw a slash after it, and then you write the conclusion. And I'm going to write it in a different color because I want to make it clear that I don't really have this. This is just a note to myself saying, this is my goal. If you're a computer nerd, this would be like a remark that you sometimes find in computer code, where the writer has left a little note to him or herself. It's not actually active part of the code, it's just a little message to yourself. That's what you're doing here. So you haven't really got C, that's what you've got to try and get. Now, in what follows, we've got not A and not C. So these are just the premises. This is the real part of the proof. Not A and C. Now, as you can see, the proof ends here because that's the conclusion. Whenever you've got the line, whenever you've got the conclusion on a line, that's the end of your proof. But what we need to fill in is this part, which tells us how we know these to be true. And the answer is, what you will fill in here is the name of one of the rules that you have learned, the inference forms in this case, the 9 inference forms, and line number or numbers, which would be the premises of that little argument. So, how do you think why is it that we know not A to be true if we know these premises are true? Not modus ponens. If it was modus ponens, because modus ponens looks like this, and I'm going to do what I did in the little video. Modus ponens look like this. So for us to arrive at this, not A by modus ponens, we would have to have something where not A was the consequent. Right? We'd have to have something, then not A, and then we'd have to have that something. But not A is not the consequent of any of those things. Oh, I'm sorry, yeah. So you end up with a consequent. So if we arrived at this by modus ponens, we would have to have a conditional as one of these where not A is the consequent, but we don't. We've got B here and we've got C here. So we don't get not A by modus ponens. How do we get it? Modus tollens. So I'm going to do I'm going to do something slightly different from the text. I'm going to write the rule first. So we've arrived at not A by modus tollens. What that means is, somewhere we will have a line that looks like this. A, then something, not that something, and here's the line because we've arrived at not A. That's what modus tollens looks like. What line number is this one?
1.
1. Yes, that's right. So we'll write that as the first line number. But there's also a second line because modus tollens is a syllogism. So it will have two premises. This is the first one. What's the second one? 3. Yes, because it will be the denial of the consequence. So we know that it will be not B. So that's what you write. Modus tollens 1, 3. Because in effect, you've got that little argument. Okay?
So 4 and 5 are sub-conclusion?
Yeah, well, 4 is a sub-conclusion and then 5 is the overall conclusion. Yes, so there's only one sub-conclusion in this case. Something that follows from the premises but is not the conclusion, because 5 is the conclusion. All right, how do we get C then? Now notice, there will be some clues. First of all, what line do we know we have to involve somehow? Line 2. Why? Because it's got C in it. And also, it's probably going to involve line 4, because otherwise why the hell did we do that? So it's pretty much obvious that it's going to be a combination of line 2 and 4. What rule is that? What little argument does that look like? Modus ponens. Yes, so it's modus ponens. What you write is MP 2, 4.